You never think it'll happen to you. That sort of thing, infidelity, betrayal, it always feels like something you hear about happening to others. But me? No, I always trusted my wife Megan. She was the love of my life, and I believed we had a good thing going. At least, that's what I thought. Megan had been into yoga for years, and I was happy to support her hobby. She'd head to the studio a couple of times a week, come home relaxed and glowing. I figured it was good for her, gave her something to look forward to. I wasn't the type to control or keep tabs on her. Trust is the foundation of any marriage, right? Maybe that was my mistake. See, I've always been cautious in other areas of my life. I had this habit of carrying pepper spray with me. Not for any particular reason, just a precaution. You never know when you might run into trouble, like stray dogs or a couple of ratty teenagers. It's better to be safe, I thought. But I never imagined I'd end up using it for anything else. Certainly not for something as surreal as punishing my wife and her lover. Looking back now, there were signs. I guess they were small things at first. Her late nights out seemed to stretch longer. She started taking her phone everywhere, even to the bathroom. I thought nothing of it, chalking it up to just a busy life. After all, we'd been married for nearly a decade. Life happens. But maybe I was blind, or maybe she was just really good at hiding things. So, let's start from the beginning. Megan, my wife, was a yoga enthusiast. She loved it, and I loved that she had something she enjoyed. But somewhere along the way, things changed. I just didn't see it. Didn't see her change. Or maybe I didn't want to see it. And then one day, it all came crashing down. Megan's car had been in the shop for about 2 weeks. Nothing major, just a few repairs, but it meant she had to rely on taxis to get to her yoga sessions. I offered to give her a ride, but with my work schedule, I was often tied up late. And to be honest, the yoga studio was way out of the way from my usual route. It wasn't exactly convenient, but Megan, being the independent woman she was, didn't mind. She seemed to enjoy the little bit of freedom the taxi rides gave her, so I didn't think much of it. Then came the day I had an early finish at work, something that rarely happened. I was feeling good light, you know? The kind of mood where everything just seems to go your way. That afternoon, I had a sudden idea. Why not surprise Megan? She wasn't expecting me, and I thought it would be a nice gesture to show up after her yoga class, take her out for dinner, and spend a quiet evening together. I loved those moments when I could show her how much she meant to me. I wasn't one for grand gestures, but little surprises like that, they were my way of showing how much I cared. So I swung by a florist on the way. I picked out a small bouquet, nothing too flashy, just some simple, elegant flowers. Megan loved fresh flowers, especially lilies. As I drove toward the yoga studio, I felt that warm, familiar sense of happiness wash over me. It was the kind of joy that comes from knowing you're about to make someone else's day. But when I arrived at the yoga studio, the parking lot was full. I circled around, hoping for a spot to open up, but nothing. I wasn't going to let that ruin my plan, though. I parked a little ways down the street. From where I was sitting in the car, I had a good view of the building's entrance. It was perfect, really. I could just wait for Megan to finish up, watch her walk out of the building, and then step out of the car with the flowers. Totally unexpected. I glanced at the flowers lying on the passenger seat, smiled to myself, and glanced at the clock. Her class should have been finishing up soon, so I settled in and waited. My heart was light, and I was genuinely excited. As I sat there, the doors of the yoga studio swung open, and people began to spill out. I had always thought of yoga as mostly a women's thing, but as I watched, I saw both men and women leaving the class. It struck me as a bit odd, but I quickly brushed it off. Megan had never mentioned that there were men in her class, but then again, it's not like I had ever asked. No big deal, I thought. She probably didn't think it was important to bring up. More and more people exited the building, but Megan still hadn't appeared. I started to feel a slight twinge of impatience, but I told myself to relax. I was here to surprise her, after all. There was no reason to rush. And then, finally, I saw her. Megan stepped out of the building, and my heart lifted, until I noticed she wasn't alone. Walking beside her was a man. They were talking, smiling, their faces close to one another, as if sharing some private joke. My first instinct was to brush it off. Maybe he was just another yoga participant, someone she happened to know, maybe even a partner from the class. But as I watched them, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the way they looked at each other wasn't casual. There was something else there, something I couldn't quite explain. My hand moved toward the car door, ready to get out and surprise her with the flowers. But something stopped me. I paused, deciding, for reasons I couldn't understand at that moment, to just stay put and watch. They stood there on the sidewalk, still talking, still smiling. The parking lot was slowly clearing out as the last few cars drove away. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just friendly conversation. But that strange feeling gnawed at me, making me hesitate. I couldn't hear what they were saying from where I sat, but the way they were looking at each other was enough to make my pulse quicken, and not in a good way. Megan and the man started walking toward the far corner of the parking lot, where a few cars were still parked. They stopped by one of the cars, his, I guessed. Without thinking, I leaned forward in my seat, my eyes narrowing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The man opened the passenger door, and Megan got in, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. My mind raced with explanations. Maybe he was just giving her a ride because her car was still in the shop. Maybe they were friends from the class, and this was completely innocent. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something was wrong. If it were innocent, why hadn't she mentioned him before? Why hadn't she told me she had a ride lined up? I sat there in my car, frozen, watching as the man climbed into the driver's seat. The engine started, and the car pulled out of the parking lot. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do, but my instincts kicked in. I needed to know where they were going. I threw the flowers into the back seat, started my car, and pulled out to follow them. It was evening, the sky beginning to darken, and the streets were quiet. I stayed a few cars behind, trying to keep a safe distance so they wouldn't notice me. I didn't follow them for long, maybe 5-7 minutes at most. They drove steadily, turning down a few streets until they arrived at a quiet, out-of-the-way spot. Not exactly the kind of place you'd go for a casual chat. It was evening now, and the streetlights cast long shadows over the road, giving everything a dim, muted glow. The car pulled up near a building that didn't seem to get much traffic. It wasn't completely hidden, but it was definitely off the beaten path. I kept my distance, parking far enough away that they wouldn't notice me. My heart was racing, and I could feel the tension building in my chest, but I still wasn't jumping to conclusions. After all, maybe they were just stopping for a minute. Maybe he was dropping her off, or maybe they were waiting for something. But the longer I sat there, watching, the more I started to feel uneasy. For minutes passed, and their car just sat there. No one got out. No movement. Nothing. The minutes dragged on, and the knot in my stomach tightened. It didn't make sense. Why would they stop here? Why not go straight home, or to some other obvious destination? I started to get frustrated, staring at their car like it held some secret I couldn't decipher. My mind raced with all kinds of thoughts, but oddly enough, betrayal wasn't one of them. At least not yet. It's strange how we can convince ourselves that everything is fine, even when things clearly aren't. I guess part of me didn't want to believe that anything was wrong. I trusted Megan. I wanted to trust her, but that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. Damn it, what is this nonsense? I muttered to myself, my patience wearing thin. Finally, I decided I couldn't just sit there any longer. I needed to know what was going on. I got out of my car slowly, careful not to make any noise. I kept low, staying in the shadows, and began to move toward their car. Each step felt heavy, my heart pounding louder with every inch I crept forward. I crept up to the back of the car, my feet moving silently on the pavement thanks to the lightweight sneakers I had on. Each step felt like it took a lifetime, my breath barely escaping my lungs as I neared the vehicle. I could hear light music playing from inside, muffled by the closed windows, but just loud enough to catch my ear. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached the rear of the car, the eerie quiet of the evening amplifying every sound around me. I paused, trying to study myself. What was I even doing? A part of me still clung to the hope that this was nothing, that I'd find some innocent explanation, and we'd laugh about how paranoid I'd been. But then I heard it. A voice, a weak, lazy male voice drifting out from the car. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Baby, come on a little faster, come on, do it. I froze. My mind struggled to process what I just heard. It was surreal, almost like I wasn't really there. My body moved on its own as my hand reached for the leather case on my belt, where I kept my pepper spray. I flipped it open quietly, my fingers trembling slightly as I pulled out the spray, gripping it tight in my right hand. I moved toward the driver's side of the car, taking slow, careful steps, trying to keep my movements controlled even though inside, I was unraveling. The window on the driver's side was cracked open, just enough to let the sound slip through. The music, the voice, and something else, something I didn't want to acknowledge yet. As I got closer, I could finally see inside the car. There he was, sitting in the driver's seat, his head thrown back against the headrest. A sick grin stretched across his face, eyes shut in pure satisfaction. And then there was Megan, my Megan. Her head was in his lap. I think you can already guess what she was doing to him. I stood there, frozen, as 1,000 thoughts exploded in my mind at once. It was like time stopped, and all I could do was stand there, looking at the woman I loved, the woman I trusted, doing that with some random guy from her yoga class. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. Couldn't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. What was this? What the hell was happening? Was this really Megan? My wife, the woman I thought I knew so well? The woman I'd planned a surprise dinner for? The woman I'd been waiting for with a bouquet of flowers just minutes earlier? Rage surged through me like a wildfire, consuming everything in its path. My hand tightened around the pepper spray, my knuckles turning white as I gripped it harder. The spray felt cool and solid in my hand, a small comfort in the midst of the storm raging inside me. I couldn't take it anymore. The sight of them together, the betrayal, the disgust, I snapped. Without thinking, I brought the pepper spray up to the small gap in the car window. My hand shook, but not from fear, from pure, unbridled rage. With a burst of anger, I pressed the button hard, releasing a furious stream of spray into the car. It only took a second. The effect was instant. Megan jerked away from the guy, her body reacting in shock. In her panic, I could tell she had scraped his magic wand with her teeth. His scream of horror was unmistakable, a twisted blend of pain and confusion. His groan echoed through the car as both of them were ripped from whatever fantasy they had been living. Within moments, the pepper spray hit them full force. The burning, the coughing, the struggle to breathe. The guy, Bill, I guessed from the way Megan had called out to him, tried to open the driver's side door in a blind panic. But I was ready. I jammed my foot against the door, blocking his way. He wasn't getting out that easily. Megan, gasping and choking, fumbled out through the passenger side, her hands covering her eyes, stumbling blindly. Bill wasn't far behind, realizing his only way out was also through the passenger seat. They spilled out onto the sidewalk, both of them coughing, eyes streaming tears as the pepper spray worked its magic. Megan's voice broke through the chaos, her panicked cry filling the air. Bill, what the hell just happened? Bill was on the ground, clutching his face, his voice raw and panicked. Megan, first, you almost took a bite out of my little friend. He groaned in agony. And second, some bastard just attacked us. I stood there, a few feet away, watching them writhe on the sidewalk. The satisfaction of seeing them like this, reduced to coughing, crying messes, couldn't fully numb the ache that was growing in my chest. My heart still hurt. My mind was spinning. But in that moment, I just watched, my breath steady and cold. Megan tried to blink through the burning, her voice shaky as she attempted to make out who was standing before them. Her hands rubbed at her swollen eyes, and despite her discomfort, she squinted in my direction. Then, in a trembling voice, she spoke. Tom, is that you? Her words were weak, almost desperate, as if she was hoping it wasn't me, hoping this was all some terrible dream she could wake up from. I looked at her, my heart heavy with a mix of sadness and fury. Yes, darling, I said, my voice low and controlled. It's me. I wanted to surprise you, but things didn't go quite as I expected. She flinched at the calmness in my voice, as if the lack of screaming somehow made it worse. Her tears mixed with the burn of the pepper spray, leaving her helpless as she choked on her words. Phil, still writhing in pain and desperately trying to blink away the burning in his eyes, shouted, "Megan, who the hell is this? Do you know him?" But Megan wasn't listening to him anymore. Her mind was focused on one thing, and it wasn't me or Bill. "Water," she rasped, coughing through the pain. "We need water." Unfortunately for them, there was no water in sight. Their desperate cries for relief echoed down the empty street, but no help was coming. Then, out of sheer desperation, Megan spotted a puddle nearby, left over from the rain the night before. It was dirty, murky, but in their panic, neither of them cared. They dropped to their knees, scooping the filthy water into their hands, splashing it over their burning eyes in a frantic attempt to soothe the pain. They looked pathetic, kneeling in the dirt, clawing at the ground for relief, reduced to scrambling for whatever scraps of comfort they could find. And I just stood there, watching them, my chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. This wasn't how I imagined my night going. Not at all. But there they were, Megan and Bill, drenched in filthy water, blinded by pepper spray, the weight of their choices crashing down on them. And somehow that image was the only thing that made sense anymore. I didn't have long to enjoy the twisted satisfaction of watching Megan and Bill splash filthy water into their eyes. The quiet street wasn't so quiet anymore. A couple of people passed by, slowing down to take in the bizarre scene. It wasn't every day you saw two people on their knees, drenched, desperately scooping water from a puddle. One guy, maybe in his late 30s, stopped and asked, "Hey, what's going on here?" I clenched my jaw, my anger still boiling beneath the surface. "Drug addicts," I spat, my voice low and cold. "Parked in the wrong place. They've had a bad trip." He glanced over at Megan and Bill, who were still coughing and rubbing their eyes, faces soaked with muddy water. In their current state, they looked the part. Whoever saw them wouldn't doubt my story. The guy nodded, probably deciding it wasn't worth getting involved, and walked off, muttering something under his breath. But then someone must have called the police. It wasn't long before I saw the familiar red and blue lights flickering at the end of the street. A patrol car pulled up, and two officers got out, their faces stern, scanning the scene in front of them. The officers approached cautiously, asking questions as they took in the scene. Two soaked and gasping people and me, standing off to the side, still holding the pepper spray in my hand. They didn't waste any time. Within minutes, they had the three of us in the back of the squad car, and we were being driven to the police station. The ride was quiet, tense. I could feel Megan's eyes darting toward me, though she didn't dare say anything. Bill just sat there, staring at the floor, trying to wipe his eyes with his sleeve. I leaned back against the seat, my mind already figuring out exactly what I was going to say. At the station, they separated us. I waited patiently as the officer came over, clipboard in hand, ready to take my statement. I had it all worked out. I wasn't about to let this go sideways. I came to pick up my wife from her yoga class I began, my voice steady. But when I got there, I saw her sitting in the car with this man, Bill. I wanted to find out what was going on, so I walked up to the car. And, well, I saw him holding her by the head. I paused for a moment, making sure the officer was listening carefully. It looked like he was forcing her to, so I used the pepper spray to get him off her. The officer raised an eyebrow, scribbling down notes. I could tell he was taking me seriously. The funniest part was when Megan tried to explain herself. She was caught, and now she had to decide whether to admit the truth that she'd been cheating on me or spin some story. Her voice was shaky, still raw from the pepper spray, as she tried to salvage what little dignity she had left. "There's been a misunderstanding," she croaked, barely able to get the words out. "It's not what it looks like. I wasn't doing anything wrong. Bill and but she couldn't finish. The truth was hanging in the air between us, and no amount of spinning could change that. Her words sounded hollow, and I could see the officers weren't buying it. The more she tried to explain, the more desperate she sounded. Bill, on the other hand, was furious. Still wiping his eyes, He pointed at me and said, "That guy assaulted me. I didn't do anything wrong. He attacked us out of nowhere." But I didn't waver. I kept my voice calm, controlled. "I saw a man with my wife in a compromising position. What would you have done?" I asked the officer, meeting his gaze head-on. The officers exchanged a look. It was clear they weren't sure what to make of the situation. I knew they didn't want to deal with the mess of sorting out whose story was true. In the end, they took our information, wrote up reports, and told us we'd be free to go in the morning. Megan and I drove home in silence. I didn't say a word, and neither did she. The tension in the car was thick, pressing down on us like a weight neither of us knew how to lift. There were no more excuses, no more lies she could tell me. The truth had shattered everything. The woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted, was sitting beside me, and yet she felt like a stranger. When we got home, the weight of everything hit me all at once. The quiet of the house felt suffocating, pressing down on me as I stood in the doorway. I couldn't even look at her. The betrayal, the lies, it was all too much. I didn't need to hear any more excuses. I turned to Megan, my voice cold and steady. "I don't want to know or see you anymore. Our next step is divorce." Her face crumpled in shock, and I could see the panic rise in her eyes. She started stammering, tripping over her words as she desperately tried to explain herself. "Tom, wait. It wasn't what it looked like. You misunderstood everything. I made a mistake. There was no intimacy, I swear. Please just let me explain." I clenched my fists, trying to keep my anger in check. "Megan, don't take me for an idiot. I saw what I saw." The image of her head in that guy's lap flashed through my mind, making my chest tighten with rage. Her tears flowed faster now. She was crying, pleading for forgiveness, her voice cracking with desperation. "Please, Tom. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It was just, I don't know what I was thinking. Please forgive me." Forgiveness? She didn't even have the decency to admit the truth. I wasn't looking for lies, and her denial only made it worse. I stared at her, my voice firm. "How long has this been going on, Megan? How long have you been cheating?" But she lied. Of course she did. Her voice shook as she said, "There's no affair, Tom. I swear to you this was just... It was nothing. That was it." That was when I knew there was no coming back from this. The fact that she couldn't even own up to her actions told me everything I needed to know. She didn't just betray me. She insulted me by thinking I'd believe this nonsense. I looked at her, my patience long gone. "So you're telling me you're ready to give some random guy oral sex in a car? Just like that? No affair? Nothing behind my back? Just a spur-of-the-moment thing?" Her response was more tears, more hysteria. She didn't even answer my question. She was too busy wailing and pleading, as if her emotional outburst would somehow erase what had happened. Her crying didn't move me. It didn't bring back the trust she'd shattered. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to get away from her, away from this mess. Silently, I pulled out my phone and called the lawyer. As I was arranging a meeting, Megan lunged at me, trying to snatch the phone from my hand. She was panicking, her desperation turning into a frantic attempt to stop me from making the call. "Stop, Tom. Don't do this, please," she cried, grabbing at me, trying to block my way. But I kept my voice calm and focused, ignoring her as I spoke to the lawyer, locking in a time for the next day. When I hung up, I couldn't stand to be in the same room with her any longer. Her hysteria wasn't getting to me. It was just irritating, making me want to leave even faster. I grabbed a small bag from the closet and started packing a few essentials. Anything to get out of there for the night. She stood in my way, her arms stretched out, trying to stop me. "Tom, please don't go. We can fix this. I love you, I swear we can make it work. Just stay, talk to me." She sobbed, her voice hoarse from crying. But I had nothing left to say. I broke away from her, pushing past her outstretched arms. I didn't look back as I headed for the door. "Goodbye, Megan." I drove off, leaving her behind, her cries fading into the distance. The truth was, she wasn't crying for me. She was crying because her world had crumbled and she knew there was no way to put it back together. A few months later, the divorce was finalized. Megan tried to get me back, of course. She showed up at my door more than once, begging for another chance. But I didn't trust her. How could I? The woman I had loved, the one I had trusted with everything, had turned into someone I didn't recognize. Let her find another fool to fall for her lies. I wasn't going to be that man anymore. As for me, I moved on. It wasn't easy, but I knew that staying with her would have destroyed me. In the end, I realized that the trust we had was gone for good, and once trust is broken, there's no turning back. I was free now, free from her lies, free from her betrayal, and that was all that mattered. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel now. Have a nice day.
Now start second story.
I never thought a simple business trip would turn into an absolute nightmare. I got pulled over by the police, and after a brief but incredibly tense conversation, they decided to search my car. I barely had time to process what was happening before one of the officers popped the trunk and found someone inside. In that moment, I couldn't logically connect my wife to the situation, aside from the fact that I was driving her car. That's when everything went downhill and I found myself at the center of the most ridiculous scandal of my life. Let me tell you everything from the beginning. After some time, I put the whole puzzle together, but at the time of my arrest by the police, I didn't understand anything. It all started with my beloved wife, Emily, taking a lover behind my back. I trusted Emily and loved her dearly. In my eyes, she was perfect, a devoted wife and an amazing partner. There were no signs, no hints of betrayal. That day began like any other. I got up early, kissed Emily goodbye, and headed to work. My office was only 15 minutes away from home, but my job had me buried in deadlines and meetings, so I was away from the house for most of the day. I worked hard, trying to provide for our future, to build something solid for us. I thought we were on the same page until everything unraveled. Emily, as it turned out, had more free time on her hands than I realized. While I was busy with work, she was busy doing something else. Of course, I didn't know this at the time. I was blissfully ignorant, thinking that Emily spent her days running errands, maybe meeting friends for lunch or working on her art projects. That day around lunchtime, everything was going smoothly until my phone rang. My boss needed me to run to a neighboring city for an urgent business matter. It wasn't anything major, just a routine task that would have easily been done by the evening. I figured I'd knock it out quickly and be back home for dinner. I packed up my things, grabbed my keys, and headed out to the parking lot. But the moment I turned on the ignition, I heard it, the strange grinding sound that had been bothering me for a while. That morning, I ignored it, assuming it was just a minor issue. But now, with a longer drive ahead of me, I couldn't shake the thought, what if the car breaks down halfway? Frustration bubbled up inside me. Damn it, I muttered under my breath. It was already going to be a long day, and the last thing I needed was a broken-down car on a highway in the middle of nowhere. At that moment, a solution popped into my head. Emily's car. I knew she'd be home, and her car was newer and more reliable than mine. It was perfect. Without thinking too much, I decided to swing by the house and swap cars. Problem solved. As I drove toward our home, I decided to call her. I dialed Emily's number, and after a few rings, she picked up. "Hey, are you home?" I asked casually, thinking nothing of it. There was a pause on the other end, and when she spoke, her voice sounded off. Confused. Nervous. Yeah, I'm here. Just sitting in the car," she replied. I furrowed my brow. Sitting in the car? What was she doing sitting in the car in the middle of the day? "Okay, I'll be there in 15 seconds. I need to take your car. I'll explain when I get there," I said, already turning onto our street. "Wait, what? You're almost here?" she asked, her voice laced with panic. The fear and confusion in her tone threw me off for a second. I didn't know why she was acting so strangely, but I brushed it off. Maybe she was just caught off guard. Maybe she hadn't expected me home so soon. Now, looking back, I understand why she sounded so nervous. In that moment, she wasn't alone in the car. Her lover was with her, and when she heard that I was just a few seconds away, panic set in. They didn't have time to come up with a plan or make a clean getaway. So, in their desperation, they chose the quickest solution: hide him in the trunk. Emily's car had a feature where you could access the trunk from the back seat. It wasn't ideal, but with me already on my way, they didn't have much of a choice. The moment she hung up the phone, her lover scrambled into the trunk, and Emily tried to act as if everything was normal. But I could hear the fear in her voice. She was rattled, and I had no idea why. As soon as I pulled into the driveway and stepped out of my car, I saw Emily get out of hers. She was standing by the driver's door, looking a little tense, like she was caught off guard. Her face had this strange mix of fear and nervousness, but she forced a smile as I approached. "Hi, honey. It's good you didn't have time to leave," I said, not thinking much of her uneasy expression. "Joe, what happened?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why are you so worked up so early?" I shrugged it off, too focused on my sudden change of plans to notice her odd behavior. "I don't have time to explain everything," I told her. "There's something wrong with my car's engine, and I've got to go to the neighboring city for work. If I can get this done today, I'll be back by evening, maybe with a bonus in hand." Her nervousness seemed to spike when I mentioned needing her car. "Oh, well, I was actually about to go out, too. I have some errands, important stuff," she stammered, trying to find an excuse. I waved her off. "Your errands can wait, Emily. This is work. If I miss this, I could lose out on a huge opportunity. I'll be out until tonight." She hesitated. I could see the wheels turning in her head, trying to come up with to stop me. "Why don't you come inside for a bit first?" she suggested, her voice taking on a desperate tone. "You're probably starving. I could make you a quick snack or a coffee before you go." It was such an odd suggestion. Normally, she'd understand if I was in a rush, but she was stalling, doing anything she could to keep me from getting into her car. But I wasn't in the mood for delays. "No, I've got to go now," I said firmly, brushing past her. Emily's face paled, her forced smile slipping as she realized I wasn't giving in. Her voice grew shaky as she said, "Maybe we could." "Emily, give me the keys," I interrupted more urgently now. "I don't have time for this." Her hand trembled as she reached into her pocket, and when she handed me the keys, I could feel how cold and clammy her skin was. There was a strange look of horror in her eyes, like something awful was about to happen. But at the time, I thought she was just upset about me leaving in a rush. I took the keys, quickly got into her car, and without another word, I drove off. Now that I'm telling this story, I can only imagine what she must have felt at that moment. She had just hidden her lover in the trunk, and there I was, completely unaware, driving off with him trapped inside. I didn't suspect a thing. In her head, she must have been praying to every god she could think of, hoping that her secret wouldn't be revealed. The terror she must have felt as she watched me disappear down the street, knowing that one wrong move could expose everything, must have been unbearable. But for me, it was just another work day. At least that's what I thought. Before you get all the details, please don't make fun of me. Also, please be kind and subscribe to the channel right now. So there I was, cruising through the city in Emily's car, trying to get my business done as quickly as possible so I could get back home. I thought I'd make good time, but of course, fate had other plans. The universe seemed to conspire against me. Traffic jams popped up at every corner, and traffic lights? Well, they decided to take the day off, blinking like they were at a Christmas party. I felt like I was stuck in a video game where the objective was test Joe's patience. Spoiler alert, I was failing. Now, I'm the kind of guy who loses at the moment anything stands in the way of my perfectly laid out plans. So, by the time I hit another roadblock, this one due to construction, I was at my wit's end. My brilliant idea? Why not just go around all these law-abiding citizens and break a few traffic rules? I mean, who cares, right? It's not like speeding and rule-breaking ever got anyone into trouble. Oh wait, confident in my own stupidity, I zipped around the cars like I was in the last lap of a Formula One race. Not even 5 minutes passed before I spotted something in my rearview mirror. Red and blue flashing lights. The police. Just my luck. "Damn it," I muttered, knowing full well that I was about to get what was coming to me. I pulled over, trying to act casual, but on the inside, I was panicking. What's worse than getting pulled over? Getting pulled over while driving your wife's car with no time to explain anything. The officer came up to the window, and let's just say he didn't look like he was having the best day either. His face was a mix of exhaustion and oh great, another one of these guys. I was nervous and I guess it showed because he didn't waste any time asking me to get out of the car. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," he said sternly, not even a hint of humor. I knew I was in trouble, but I had no idea how bad it was about to get. He gave me the usual speech about reckless driving, speeding, and how I was acting like I was the king of the road. Just as I thought I was about to get slapped with a hefty fine, the officer decided to inspect the car. I figured fine, there's nothing weird here. Maybe he'd give me a ticket and I could get on with my day. But then he walked around to the back. And that's when everything went sideways. He opened the trunk and surprise, there was a man. A whole man, just lying there, looking as confused as I felt. I stared at the guy in the trunk, my brain short-circuiting. I mean, I knew my wife wasn't into carpooling, so how did we end up here? The officer didn't find it amusing. In fact, he pulled out his gun, pointed it at me, and called his partner over. I froze. I mean, what would you do if you suddenly found out you were unknowingly chauffeuring a person around in your trunk? My first instinct was to laugh because it felt like I was in the middle of a bad sitcom. "Sir, step away from the vehicle," the officer barked. Next thing I knew, I was handcuffed and stuffed into the back of a police car. So much for my quick business trip. But the fun didn't stop there. They dragged my unexpected passenger out of the trunk. His name was Terry, by the way. Terry, who had no idea what he was doing in my trunk either. "Were you kidnapped?" the officer asked Terry, while holding on to him like he was a dangerous fugitive. Terry looked baffled. "No, I wasn't kidnapped." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Did you illegally get into someone else's car?" Terry scratched his head. "Well, not exactly. The situation is complicated. It's not what you think." At this point, I was sitting in the back of the police car, watching this circus unfold in front of me. It was a mix of ridiculous and tragic, and I honestly didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I mean, here I was, just trying to borrow my wife's car to get to work, and now I was being arrested for kidnapping a guy named Terry. What a day. The officer couldn't handle it anymore and slapped handcuffs on Terry too. So there we were, two complete strangers, both cuffed, heading to the police station to sort out the situation. I couldn't help but think how absurd this all was. Instead of a short business trip, I was now part of some bizarre comedy sketch, where my co-star was a guy who had no idea how he ended up in the trunk of a car. As we sat in the back of the police car, Terry turned to me, shrugged, and said, "Hey, at least the trunk was pretty spacious." So there we were, Terry and I, sitting in the same interrogation room like two criminals in a bad cop movie. I could hear him breathing heavily next to me, fidgeting in his chair like a guilty kid caught stealing cookies. We hadn't exchanged a single word since the trunk incident, but the tension between us was thicker than fog. I was already preparing my speech. "Hi, I'd like to call a lawyer because believe it or not, I don't normally drive around with men stashed in the back of my car." I called my boss next. "Hey, slight problem. You're not gonna believe this, but I got arrested." There was a pause. "Arrested? Joe, you're supposed to be on a business trip." "Yeah, about that. I borrowed my wife's car, and it turns out she had a bonus passenger in the trunk." Long story short, could you send me a lawyer? I could almost hear my boss rubbing his temples. "Fine, I'll send Winston." The officer stood in front of us, arms crossed, looking like he'd had enough of both of us already. "Do you know this man?" he asked me, pointing at Terry. "No," I answered, maybe a little too quickly. "I have no idea who he is. I just borrowed my wife's car. That's it." I could hear Terry shifting in his seat, clearly nervous. The officer turned to him next. "What about you? How did you end up in the trunk of this man's car?" Terry coughed, scratched his head, and then, in the most ridiculous tone possible, said, "Ugh, I don't really remember. It's kinda complicated." Complicated? Complicated? Took everything I had not to laugh out loud. I mean, come on, Terry, really? That's the best you could come up with? Even the officer was giving him a look that screamed seriously. "Dude?" But Terry wasn't talking. Not with me sitting right there. He kept dodging the questions, pretending like he didn't know what was going on. I could see him avoiding eye contact with me, clearly terrified that if he said too much, the truth about his connection to Emily would spill out. He was playing the fool, hoping to keep his affair under wraps a little longer. At this point, the officer was about ready to slap both of us with something just for wasting his time. And then, as if things couldn't get weirder, in walks Emily. Her eyes were as wide as saucers the moment she saw us. I mean, I don't think she expected to walk in and find both her husband and her secret lover sitting side by side, handcuffed. Honestly, it was the kind of shock that probably deserved a photo, but unfortunately, I was too busy being accused of kidnapping to enjoy the moment. Emily froze. "Ugh, what's going on here?" she stammered, looking like she wanted to disappear. The officer cut to the chase. "Ma'am, do you know these two men?" Emily blinked, looked at me, looked at Terry, looked back at me. It was like watching a bad sitcom where the punchline just wouldn't land. She started mumbling something, but it wasn't making much sense. Finally, she snapped out of it and said, "Can I speak to you? Privately?" I knew exactly why she wanted a private chat. There was no way she was going to explain Terry in front of me. The officer, probably eager to get some real answers, agreed and took her into another room. Great, I thought. Just another episode in this ever-growing soap opera. A few minutes later, they took Terry into a separate room too, probably to see if he could come up with a better story than I don't remember. I was left alone, sitting there like the last one to find out about the party. Just then, Winston, my lawyer, finally showed up. He walked in with that same amused smirk on his face, the kind of grin that said, "Oh, this is going to be good, Joe." He greeted me with a chuckle. "You've really outdone yourself this time." Then Winston said, "I have already spoken to the officers. There has been some misunderstanding. You will be released soon." "Thanks for the vote of confidence, Winston," I said, rolling my eyes. "Can you stop laughing long enough to do me a favor?" Winston grinned. "What's the plan?" "You said they'd let me go soon," I explained. "But I need you to find out what Emily told them. I have a feeling she's not going to tell me the truth at home." Winston nodded. Plan B, smart thinking. He couldn't help but laugh again. "Man, you're going to be a legend in the office. Who else gets arrested for reckless driving and has a guy hiding in their wife's trunk?" I sighed. "Yeah, well, I'm glad my misery can bring you some joy." Eventually, the officers came back and handed me a speeding ticket. I was free to go. No charges, no kidnapping accusations, just a ticket. Meanwhile, Terry was still being questioned, and Emily? Well, she wasn't looking too thrilled either. As Winston and I left the station, I couldn't help but shake my head. "This is a mess," I muttered. Winston chuckled. "Don't worry, I'll dig around and get the full story. But for now, just take a deep breath. You're free, Joe." Yeah, I was free. But something told me the real drama was waiting for me back at home. After the police station ordeal, I called a taxi for Emily and me. Winston, ever the supportive lawyer, gave me a sly wink and whispered in my ear, "I'll send you the information." I nodded and gave him a quick wink back, knowing he had my back. As for Terry, well, he must have decided that a quiet exit was the best option because he sure didn't come out while Emily and I were leaving. Smart move, Terry. As we slid into the back seat of the cab, I turned to Emily, my frustration simmering just under the surface. "So what the hell was all that about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady but knowing I sounded impatient. Emily, bless her heart, immediately launched into excuses. "Joe, it was stupid. A big misunderstanding." She was fumbling for words, her story changing every second. "Terry's just a friend of some friends. They thought it would be funny to, prank me." I raised an eyebrow. "A prank? Really?" She was talking like she'd just been caught with a whoopee cushion, not a man stuffed in the trunk of her car. "Emily," I said, my patience thinning. "Are you seriously telling me that your friends thought the best prank in the world was to hide a grown man in your trunk? And you didn't think to mention that when I took your car?" She was silent for a second, scrambling to fill the gaps. "Well, I didn't know, Joe. It's all so ridiculous. You know, people do stupid things sometimes." Ridiculous was right, but not in the way she thought. By the time we got home, I was fuming. We stepped inside the house, and I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Emily, cut the crap. Terry's your lover, and you're trying to pull the wool over my eyes." She froze, staring at me like I'd slapped her. "What? No, Joe. Terry's just an acquaintance. It was all a joke that got out of hand. I don't have a lover, I swear. Her story kept changing, getting more absurd by the second. But what ticked me off the most wasn't the lie, it was the way she was spinning this whole thing, like I was the idiot for not believing her nonsense. Before I could say anything else, my phone rang. I stepped outside to take the call, needing a moment to cool down. It was Winston. "Hey Joe," he said, his voice steady. I decided to call instead of texting. This story's too crazy for a message. Anyway, your wife spun some shady tale at the station. Something about Terry being a friend, and the whole thing being a bad joke. But between you and me, nobody at the station believed her. Half of them were laughing about it. Everyone pretty much figured out Terry's her lover. I sighed, leaning against the side of the house. Yeah, I already guessed that, Winston. But she's still denying it. I thought maybe she'd tell the truth to the officers, and you'd confirm it for me. Winston chuckled softly. Joe, she told the officers what she told you. It's like she's doubling down on this whole bad joke thing. But trust me, everyone knows what's really going on. I let out a frustrated laugh. Well, screw them all. I'll handle this myself. Good luck, Joe, Winston said before hanging up. I walked back inside the house, and Emily was still there, pacing nervously. I was done with the games. Emily, I said, my voice calm but firm, enough with the stories. Just tell me the truth. But Emily, ever the stubborn one, wasn't ready to give in. Joe, I swear there's no affair. Terry's just... Give me your phone, I interrupted, tired of the excuses. Show me your calls, your messages. Prove it. That's when she snapped. Her face turned red, and she threw up her hands dramatically. No, that's my personal space, Joe. You can't just demand to see my phone. Here it came, the tantrum. She started acting like the victim, spinning the situation so fast it gave me whiplash. You took my car and caused this whole circus? And now you're acting like I'm the bad girl? How dare you accuse me like this? She was trying to turn it all around on me, like I was the one who'd shoved Terry in the trunk. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here she was, playing the part of the wronged woman, while I was just the guy trying to figure out why I'd been driving around town with her secret lover. I clenched my fists, trying to stay calm. Emily, this isn't about the car. It's about the lies. So let's stop pretending and just deal with this. But she wasn't having it. Instead of fessing up, she doubled down, pushing me further into the role of the paranoid husband who'd blown everything out of proportion. I stared at her, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. I stopped pressuring Emily after that argument. There was no point. The lies, the excuses, it was all too much. A few days later, I found myself a lawyer and filed for divorce. Emily tried to talk me out of it, coming up with more stories, but I was done listening. I couldn't stand the thought of being with someone who could lie so easily and treat me like a fool. How long had she been with Terry? Were there others? Honestly, I didn't care anymore. I just wanted out. The divorce went through smoothly, well, as smoothly as these things can. Felt like a weight lifted off my shoulders. A few months later, I ran into Terry at a grocery store. The moment was too perfect to resist. Hey Terry, I said, grinning. Need a ride in the trunk? He stared at me wide-eyed, said nothing, and then turned and bolted out of the store like he'd seen a ghost. I couldn't help but laugh. In the end, it turned out to be a funny story. But it taught me a lesson. I've got to be careful with women, and now I always check the trunk of any car I get into. If you enjoyed my story, subscribe to the channel and drop your thoughts in the comments. And remember, everyone deserves a good and faithful partner. Thanks for listening and goodbye.
Now start second story.
Welcome to my channel. Subscribe and enjoy my new stories every day. I never imagined that my life would fall apart like this. My marriage to Marcia had been the cornerstone of everything. 12 years together, 2 kids, a home we both cherished. I met her in college. She was one of those people who lit up a room, and I fell for her heart. Back then, I had no reason to think I'd be sitting here today, reflecting on how everything crumbled around me. We had a good life, or so I thought. I worked in IT, and she had a steady job in accounting. Our 2 kids, Ben and Sophie, were growing up fast, and we were the kind of family that did everything together. Beach vacations, camping trips, and family movie nights were a regular part of our routine. We'd put off having kids until we got our finances in order, but once they came along, our lives felt full. But, looking back, there were signs that things weren't as perfect as they seemed. For years, Marcia had been drifting away, bit by bit. At first, it was subtle. She started spending more time on her phone, staying late at work more often, and when I asked about it, she always had some excuse. It's just a big project, she'd say, or, I'm covering for someone who's out. I believed her. I didn't want to be the kind of husband who snooped or accused without reason. We'd been together for so long. I trusted her. But then the fighting started. Not all the time, just little spats over things that didn't seem to matter. She'd snap at me for leaving the dishes in the sink, or for working too late on a project. At first, I thought it was just stress, or that maybe we were going through one of those rough patches everyone talks about in long marriages. But as time went on, those fights grew more frequent. And when I tried to talk to her about it, to really get to the heart of what was going on, she'd shut down. I'm just tired, she'd say, or you're reading too much into things. So I let it go, thinking it was just a phase, something we'd get through together. It wasn't a phase. One night, about 3 years ago, everything came crashing down. I was up late working on a project for my job. An important deadline was looming, and I had to put in the extra hours to meet it. Marcia had already gone to bed, saying she was exhausted after a long day at work. I told her good night, kissed her on the forehead, and sat down at my computer to finish my work. That's when her phone lit up on the dresser. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. But that night, something in me shifted. I don't know if it was the way she'd been acting lately or the gut feeling I'd been pushing down for months, but I couldn't resist. I glanced at the screen. A message popped up from someone named N. It read, "Can't wait to taste you again tomorrow, baby." My heart stopped. My head started spinning, and for a few seconds I couldn't breathe. I reread the message, hoping I had seen it wrong, hoping it wasn't what I thought. But there was no mistaking it. My world collapsed in that moment. The woman I had built my life with was cheating on me. I confronted her immediately. I stormed into the bedroom, yanked the covers off her, and demanded an explanation. At first, she denied everything. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice trembling as she tried to grab her phone. But I wasn't letting it go. Not this time. "Who is in?" I asked, my voice cold, barely above a whisper. I had always been calm, level-headed, but this was different. I felt like a stranger in my own skin, my whole body shaking with rage. She stumbled over her words, tried to spin a lie, but it was no use. The truth started trickling out, slowly at first, then all at once. She'd been having an affair with a guy from her office for months. His name was Nathan, and they had started sleeping together after one of their late-night work events. The excuses she had been giving me, late nights, covering shifts, were all just lies. Every time she said she was working late, she had been with him. I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. The betrayal cut deep, and the worst part was, I couldn't understand why. I had loved her, trusted her, built a life with her. We had kids together. How could she do this? I was lonely, she said, tears streaming down her face. You weren't there for me. You were always working. I needed someone. Her words felt like poison. I wasn't there for her. I was the one who worked late nights to keep our family afloat. I was the one who made sure the bills were paid, that we had the life we always talked about. But none of that mattered now. She had made her choice, and now I had to figure out what the hell to do next. For weeks, I was in a daze. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. We had kids. We had a life together. Was I supposed to throw it all away because of one mistake? I wrestled with that question day and night, but deep down, I knew the answer. We tried counseling. I didn't know why, but part of me wanted to save the marriage. Maybe it was for the kids. Maybe it was because I didn't want to admit that everything I thought I knew was a lie. Marcia said she was sorry, that she wanted to make things right, but the trust was gone. I couldn't look at her the same way. Every time she was on her phone or came home late, I wondered if she was still seeing him. 6 months later, I filed for divorce. It was ugly. Marcia fought me on everything, custody, the house, even the kids' toys. She blamed me for everything, said I had driven her to it by being too focused on work, too distant. She played the victim while I just wanted to get out. The divorce dragged on for over a year, but finally, it was done. I got custody of the kids, kept the house, and Marcia moved out. After the dust settled, she moved in with Nathan. She posted pictures of them together online, smiling like they hadn't just destroyed my life. She even had the nerve to post pictures of them with my kids, calling Nathan their bonus dad. It felt like a knife in my chest every time I saw one of those photos, but I kept quiet. I had the kids, the house, and the future I was going to rebuild on my own. For a while, I thought that was the end of it. I thought I could move on and leave her behind, start fresh with Ben and Sophie. But life has a funny way of surprising you. A few months after the divorce was finalized, Marcia called me in the middle of the night. I could hear her sobbing on the other end of the line. At first, I thought something had happened to the kids, that maybe there had been an accident. But it wasn't that. Nathan left me, she said through her tears. He took everything. I was silent, letting her words sink in. She went on to explain how Nathan had lost his job, started drinking and gambling. Their savings were gone, and now she was broke and facing eviction. She begged me to help her, saying she had nowhere else to go. Part of me wanted to laugh. The satisfaction of seeing her fall apart like this, after everything she had done to me, was overwhelming. But there was another part of me that still felt sorry for her. We had been married for 12 years. She was the mother of my children. I couldn't just ignore that. But then I remembered everything. The lies, the betrayal, the months of sleepless nights and anxiety. And I knew exactly what I had to do. I took a deep breath and said, "You made your choice, Marcia. Now you can live with it." Then I hung up the phone. For the first time in years, I felt free. The days following Marcia's phone call were strange. After I hung up on her, I thought I'd feel triumphant, like I'd finally taken control of my life after years of emotional chaos. But the reality was more complicated. It wasn't a simple win. She had been the mother of my children, the woman I had once loved more than anything in the world. Now she was a broken mess, left behind by the man she destroyed our marriage for. Still, I couldn't let her problems become mine again. I had moved on, or at least I was trying to. It wasn't easy raising Ben and Sophie on my own, but I managed. My days were a blur of early mornings, school drop-offs, late nights finishing up work, and trying to be everything for my kids that I never wanted to fail at being. Ben was 10 now and Sophie was 8. They were at that age where they understood more than they let on, but not enough to fully grasp what had happened between Marcia and me. They knew their mom didn't live with us anymore. They knew about the divorce, but they didn't know the whole story, and I wasn't about to burden them with that kind of weight. Not yet. In some ways, they were doing better than I was. Kids are resilient. They adapt to new realities faster than adults do, and for the most part, they seemed happy. I made sure to spend as much time with them as I could. We went to the park on weekends, had movie nights with popcorn and candy, and I even took them on a camping trip, just the three of us. It wasn't the same as when Marcia had been with us, but it was enough. Every now and then, I caught Sophie looking at old family photos. There was one on the wall of all of us at Disney World from a few years back. We were all smiling, arms around each other, the perfect little family. I noticed she would stare at that picture for a while before walking away quietly. I never brought it up. What was I supposed to say? That her mom had chosen someone else over us? That she had torn our family apart for a guy who didn't even stick around? I tried to keep things normal for them, but deep down, I knew things were far from normal. Marcia, for her part, stayed away. After that desperate phone call, I didn't hear from her for weeks. She still had visitation rights, but it wasn't consistent. Sometimes she'd cancel last minute, sometimes she just wouldn't show up. I wasn't surprised. She was dealing with her own mess now, and as much as it pained me to see the kids disappointed when she bailed, I wasn't going to chase her down. That wasn't my job anymore. Then, one Saturday morning, she showed up at the house. It had been months since I'd seen her. She looked like a ghost of the woman I had once known, pale, thinner than before, with dark circles under her eyes. I could tell right away that she was struggling, but I wasn't going to make this easy for her. I stood in the doorway, blocking her from coming inside. "What do you want, Marcia?" I asked, my voice flat. She didn't meet my eyes at first, just looked down at her feet like a scolded child. "I need to see the kids." I hesitated. A part of me wanted to slam the door in her face, tell her to go to hell for everything she'd done. But then I thought of Ben and Sophie, and how much they missed her, even if they didn't say it out loud. I wasn't going to be the reason they lost their mother completely. "They're in the backyard," I said, stepping aside. Marcia looked up, surprised that I wasn't fighting her on this. She nodded and made her way through the house. I watched as she opened the back door and stepped outside. I could hear the kids' excited voices as they ran to her, calling out, "Mom." It was a bittersweet moment. As much as I hated her for what she had done, I couldn't deny that they still loved her. And that stunned more than I expected. I stayed in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, listening to the sound of their reunion. Part of me wanted to watch them, see how she acted around the kids, but I resisted the urge. It wasn't my place anymore. I had to keep reminding myself of that. After about an hour, Marcia came back inside, closing the door quietly behind her. She lingered in the hallway, looking at me like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. "What is it?" I asked, my patience wearing thin. She took a deep breath, her eyes finally meeting mine. "I need help, James." I laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh you make when you can't believe what you're hearing. "Help? After everything? You want my help?" Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I saw the woman I used to love, the one who I thought would always be by my side. But that version of her was long gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize anymore. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not my problem," I said coldly, crossing my arms. "You made your bed, Marcia. Now you have to lie in it." "I know I screwed up," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I hurt you, but I'm still their mother. I need to be there for them. I can't do that if I don't have a place to live." I shook my head, unable to believe the audacity of what she was asking. "You think I'm going to let you move back in here after everything?" "No, Marcia, that's not happening." "I'm not asking to move back in," she said quickly, wiping away a tear. "I just need a little help getting back on my feet. Please, James. For the kids." She played that card, the one I couldn't ignore. As much as I wanted to slam the door in her face and tell her to figure it out on her own, I knew the kids would suffer if she didn't get her act together. They loved her, even if I didn't anymore. I stood there for a long time, my mind racing, trying to weigh the pros and cons. Every part of me wanted to say no, to tell her to get lost and never come back. But the kids, they deserved better than this. They didn't deserve a broken, homeless mother. No matter how much I hated her, I couldn't do that to them. "Fine," I said finally. "I'll help you out with a place to stay for a while. But that's it. Don't expect anything more from me." Her shoulders sagged in relief, and she nodded, wiping away more tears. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," I said, walking toward the front door and opening it. "Just don't screw this up again." She left without another word, and I stood there, staring at the empty doorway, wondering if I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. Over the next few weeks, I helped her find a small apartment across town. Nothing fancy, but enough to get her by. I wasn't doing this for her, I was doing it for the kids. I made sure she knew that. Every time she called or texted, I kept my responses short and to the point. I wasn't interested in rebuilding anything with her. I just wanted to make sure the kids had their mom in their lives, at least in some capacity. I thought things would get easier after that I could finally move on and leave her behind for good. But life has a way of keeping you tethered to the things you most want to escape. Just when I thought I had closed the chapter on Marcia, she came back into my life in ways I never expected. A month had passed since I helped Marcia move into her apartment, and things had fallen into a strange routine. I didn't hear from her much, which suited me just fine. She had her place, she saw the kids occasionally, and we kept our interactions strictly about them. It was the best I could hope for under the circumstances. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. I was slowly rebuilding my life, trying to find some sense of normalcy after the whirlwind that had been the last few years. The pain of Marcia's betrayal wasn't as sharp anymore. I wasn't naive enough to think I was fully healed, but at least I could get through the days without feeling like I was suffocating under the weight of it. Ben and Sophie seemed to be adjusting too. They'd ask about their mom sometimes, and I'd tell them she was fine, that she was settling into her new place. They didn't ask too many questions, and I didn't offer more than I needed to. They were still too young to understand the full story, and I wanted to protect them from the worst of it for as long as I could. But it wasn't long before Marcia became more involved in our lives again. I guess I should have seen it coming. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was at the park with Ben and Sophie. They were racing each other up and down the slides, laughing and screaming in the way only kids can, while I sat on a bench nearby, keeping a watchful eye. I was lost in thought, enjoying the rare moment of peace, when I felt someone sit down next to me. "Mind if I join you?" a familiar voice asked. I didn't even need to turn to know it was her. "Marcia," I said, not hiding my surprise. "What are you doing here?" "I came to see the kids," she replied, her tone soft, almost apologetic. "I thought maybe I could join you guys for the day." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to tell her to leave, that she couldn't just show up unannounced like this. But the other part of me, the one that still thought of her as the kids' mother, knew I couldn't push her away. "Not in front of them. They're over by the slides," I said, nodding in their direction. "Go ahead." She smiled, a sad sort of smile, and got up to walk toward them. I watched as Ben and Sophie's faces lit up when they saw her, running toward her with open arms. She scooped them both up, laughing as they tackled her in a hug. For a moment I was reminded of how things used to be, the way we were before everything fell apart. I stayed on the bench, keeping my distance. I wasn't ready to play happy family, but I couldn't deny them this time with her. She'd been absent for so long that I knew they were hungry for her attention, even if they didn't say it out loud. After a while, Marcia came back and sat down next to me again, her expression more serious this time. "James, I need to talk to you about something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I stiffened, already sensing where this was going. "What is it?" "I want to be more involved in their lives," she said. "I know I haven't been the best mother these last few months, but I'm trying to make up for it. I want to start seeing them more regularly, maybe take them for weekends." I was silent for a moment, letting her words sink in. I had been dreading this conversation, but I knew it was inevitable. Marcia was their mother, and as much as I hated what she had done, I couldn't deny her the chance to rebuild her relationship with them. But I also couldn't just forgive and forget. "They deserve better than you disappearing every other week," I said, my voice harder than I intended. "You can't just pick and choose when you want to be in their lives, Marcia. They need consistency." "I know," she said quickly, her eyes pleading. "I know I screwed up, James, but I'm trying. I'm getting my life back together. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I'm asking for a chance to make things right with them." I sighed, rubbing my temples. "This isn't about me, Marcia. This is about them. If you want to be part of their lives, you need to show up. Every time. No more excuses." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I will. Promise." For the kids' sake, I agreed to let her start taking them for weekends. But I made it clear this was her last chance. If she messed up again, if she flaked or made excuses, I wasn't going to be as understanding. True to her word, Marcia started showing up more. She'd pick the kids up on Fridays after school and drop them off on Sundays. I could tell they were happy to have her back in their lives, even if they didn't fully understand why she had been gone in the first place. And slowly, I started to relax. Maybe she was really trying. Maybe she had learned her lesson. But as with everything in our marriage, things weren't as simple as they seemed. One night, about 2 months into this new arrangement, Marcia called me out of the blue. It was late, almost midnight, and I was already in bed. The phone rang, and for a moment, I thought it was an emergency. My heart raced as I grabbed it off the nightstand, expecting to hear something terrible about the kids. But it wasn't about them. It was about her. "James," she said, her voice shaky, "I need to talk to you. Can I come over?" "What's going on?" I asked, sitting up, my heart still pounding. "Is everything okay?" There was a long pause on the other end, and then she whispered I made a mistake. Those words sent a chill down my spine. I had heard them before countless times, and every time they had led to more pain, more betrayal. "Marcia, it's late," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "If it's important, just tell me now." "Can't," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, James. I just need to talk to you in person." Against my better judgment, I agreed. I told her to come by, but warned her that if this was some ploy to get me to help her again, it wasn't going to work. She promised it wasn't, but I didn't believe her. Not really. She showed up at my door 20 minutes later, looking worse than I had ever seen her. Her face was pale, her hair a mess, and her eyes were red from crying. I could tell right away that whatever this was, it wasn't good. I let her inside, but kept my distance, crossing my arms as she stood in the middle of the living room, wringing her hands. "What is it?" I asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "Why are you here?" She looked at me, her lip trembling. "I messed up again, James." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean?" I saw Nathan again," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean to, but it just happened." I stared at her, my blood boiling. After everything, after all the promises she had made to the kids, to me she had gone back to him. The man she had wrecked our family for. "You're kidding me," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "After all this time, after everything you put me and the kids through, you went back to him?" She nodded, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "It was a mistake. I know that now. He doesn't want anything to do with me. He used me, James. I was stupid, and now I've lost everything." I wanted to yell at her, to scream about how selfish she was, how she had destroyed our family for nothing. But instead, I just stood there, staring at her in disbelief. How many times had I been in this exact situation, listening to her excuses, watching her cry, only to be betrayed again? "I can't help you," I said finally, my voice cold. "Not this time. I don't expect you to," she whispered, wiping her eyes. I don't know where else to go." "Go home, Marcia," I said, walking to the door and opening it. "You're not my problem anymore." She looked at me for a long moment, like she was hoping I'd change my mind. But I didn't. I stood there, waiting, until she finally nodded and walked out the door. As soon as she was gone, I locked the door behind her and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. I had done it. I had finally cut her off, for good this time. There was no going back. I wasn't going to let her drag me down with her anymore. Weeks went by after that night, and I thought I had finally closed the chapter on Marcia. I had drawn a line in the sand, a boundary that I refused to let her cross again. It was the only way I could protect myself, protect the kids. Life seemed to move forward. The routine became steady, school drop-offs, work, weekends with Ben and Sophie, and no more late-night calls from Marcia. I had convinced myself that I had done everything right. She had pushed me to the edge, and I had cut her off at the right time. I started to feel a sense of relief, as if I could finally reclaim my life. But life has a way of turning that peace into chaos when you least expect it. It was a Saturday afternoon when the doorbell rang. Ben and Sophie were upstairs playing video games, and I was folding laundry in the living room. The kids had spent the night with Marcia the weekend before, and everything had gone smoothly, or so I thought. I figured it was just a package delivery, maybe the mailman. But when I opened the door, I saw 2 police officers standing on my porch. "Mr. James Carter," one of them asked. "Yeah," I replied, my stomach immediately sinking. "Is something wrong?" "We need to speak with you about Marcia Carter." The air left my lungs in an instant. Something about their tone, the way they looked at me with that mix of professional detachment and sympathy, I knew this wasn't going to be good. I stepped aside, letting them in, my heart pounding in my chest. They sat down at the kitchen table and I followed, barely able to keep myself upright. I don't even remember the exact words they used. Something about an accident, something about her car being found off the road, flipped over in a ravine. They said it appeared she had been driving erratically, that it was possible she had been drinking, though the toxicology report wasn't back yet. The finality of it hit me like a truck. Marcia was gone. Dead. I sat there, staring at the officers, unable to process what they were telling me. How was this possible? How could she be dead? Just weeks ago, she was standing in my living room, begging for another chance, crying over the mess she had made of her life. I didn't even get to say goodbye. The last thing I had told her was to go home, that I couldn't help her. Now I would never be able to help her, even if I wanted to. The officers asked me if I needed anything, if I had someone to call. But I was too numb to respond. I just shook my head. They left me with a card, told me to call if I had any questions, and then they were gone, leaving me alone in the house that now felt unbearably quiet. I didn't know what to do. I sat there, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. Marcia had made mistakes, yes, but I never wished this on her. I never wanted this to be her ending. She was the mother of my kids. She had been my wife. How was I going to explain this to Ben and Sophie? How was I going to look them in the eye and tell them that their mom wasn't coming back? The thought of them shattered whatever wall I had been holding up inside. I broke down, my body shaking with sobs that I hadn't let myself feel in years.